What we're going to be talking about is dyeing rawhide. I know everybody's got their own technique. This is basically what I use. It's RIT liquid dye. Very easy to use. I have a gallon ice cream tub that I'll put it into and actually keep it that way. I put the lid on when I'm done and store it in a cabinet out of the way. And I have, it's not the cherry red, I think it's a scarlet red, that I literally have had in that same tub for the last 10 years.
Well, I've the same way. I keep mine. I've had some 10 years and it works just as good. I don't see any use changing it if it's going to work.
Yeah, you know, and I've never noticed any mold or anything on that, like that on it. And every once in a while, I'll just add a little bit more color to it, maybe a half of this bottle every couple of years, just to keep the consistency up. But basically, the process is pretty simple. Put one of these in a gallon jug and fill it about halfway full with water. And I just stir it up a little bit. I start out and use warm water. When I initially mix it, I don't think it really matters, but
I use warm water.
Yeah,
I think it works. It seems to work better.
I think on that initial mixing, it probably does help dissolve and get everything mixed up. But the actual process for dyeing is very simple. You can take a piece of just cut soga string or even a final string, depending on your preference, and basically just put it in the dye. And I'll just either my pocket knife or an old fork or something like that I can push it down in and make sure it gets all the way down in the dye, and maybe stir it around a little bit if you hadn't messed with your dye in a while, just to get the pigment kind of moving around. And depending on how rich the color you want, depends on how long you're going to leave it in there. You know, if you're working with a bone dry string, it's going to take it probably 10 minutes or so for that string to get back soft a little bit and really start absorbing the dye. Because essentially what you're doing is, as that string softens, the pores in it are opening up, allowing that water inside. And when we pull it out of the dye, what's going to happen is we're going to stretch it out on either just a board or something like that, to where it's up in the air and can kind of air out. And as the water evaporates, the pigment stays in the rawhide. And that's where we get our colored rawhide from.
And I think something important, when you hang it out to dry, it's going to contract and shrink, the string is. And you don't want to really stretch it sure enough while it's wet. You want to wait till you feel it going to get a little hard and stiff and dry. Then you want to just pull it just till it comes back to its original length. And that's all you want to do to it. And then so you just pull it till it stops. Don't stretch it, just till it stops. And then let it get pretty well dry before you get ready to use it. But then something very important is you want to wipe it down before you try to braid or it'll bleed out into your whatever you're braiding it to. I just put saddle soap on it, take a paper towel, rub it and look at it till it quits coming off on that paper towel. When it quits coming off on that paper towel, it's ready to use.
Yeah. And one thing, this string hasn't been in this dye very long, and you see how much color it's picked up already. You know, it hasn't, yeah, that's already a nice color. If you want it to be a little bit richer, you can put it back in here. I've actually taken string and swapped it from my red to, say, my brown for a little bit, and then back to my red, and actually give it a much deeper or different color. And, you know, so the biggest thing with any of this is experimentations. Right today we're showing RIT dye. I've used coffee, walnuts, you know, there's all kinds of natural dyes out there also. I know folks that boil onion peels.
I've used
and yeah, so basically just use your imagination. But one thing that I've noticed also is a string that has been dyed doesn't stretch as easily as an untreated string. In my buttons and things like that, if I'm doing a colored interweave, I can have that string a little bit wetter than I normally would braiding, and it doesn't distort as easily as a natural string. I don't know if it's just the added chemical to it or whatever, but it evidently fills in the structure of the rawhide a little bit more and just gives it more body to where it makes it a little bit stronger string. This is probably pretty good as far as color. What do you think, Billy?
I believe it's good.
Would you do a little bit more or leave it in for a
I
while?
think it's good enough.
Okay.
What I would do now, I would take and rinse it.
We don't happen to have a bucket of cold water.
I can grab one, I just brought a bucket of
That would be awesome.
Now, is it your experience that red will bleed out quicker than like brown or
You know,
more or so?
Which I rinse it pretty darn good and let it dry basically back to natural,
Right.
you know, or dry completely, because I'll let it, like I say, hang out on a board, or I use an old wire saddle stand in the shop and just lay it over that, you know, back and forth where it's not touching the ground, and just let it air dry. And when it's almost back dry, I'll roll it back up in a tamale or whatever and then store it away. You know, but like I say, all I do is rinse in cold water. I know Clint said he uses a little bit of vinegar in his dye to set the dye better, but I've never noticed it bleeding that much.
Yeah, I've noticed red will bleed more than brown.
Okay,
But
and that could
I
be.
would rinse my red more than I
Yeah.
do my brown.
What does letting it completely dry, I mean totally bone dry, and then redamp when you want to braid it, set it more, or
I think it does.
Yeah.
I'm always a little impatient and ready
Yeah,
to use it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it does. I think you're right.
Yeah, you know, and I'll have a piece of string depending on if I'm dyeing a little bit or a lot, and I might get halfway through a project and run out of colored string, you know, on a couple interweaves that I want to do, and I have to go cut a piece and dye it before I can finish up the project. And, you know, so I might cut a strip that long and throw it in there and have to wait for it to harden up, and then I'll take and get it almost to braiding, you know, dryness, and then I'll just start slathering soap on it. And you'll see a little bit of that residue come off on your soap, and then I'll take a rag and go ahead and do it, and that seems to help set the dye in also. You know, a lot of it's just experimentation, but that's, you know, how it works pretty well for me.
I think that's what it works.
Yeah.
I found that on brown dye and string, sometimes you need that much more, and you ran out. If you got a green walnut with the hull still on it, take your knife and make a little cut.
You pull your
Pull it
string
through
through
there a
there.
few times, let it sit for a few minutes,
Yeah.
and then go and braid
Yeah.
it.
You know, I guess if a person wanted all brown string, they could
If you're doing brown string, it
collect them a
works.
bunch of walnuts and go on. But no, I like this method here because it's very simple. You've got a wide array of colors.
Yeah.
You know, and like I say, you can start out in one color and then switch to another and even change the shades of it.
One thing about the natural dyes is it's hard to get a consistent color
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
after time.
Yeah.
One time you get a good color you want, you do the same thing. Next time you may not get the same color. It's very inconsistent.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, when we're done, we'll just kind of dip this in one more time, make sure it's all there. But and you will get this stuff on your fingers, but it's not a big deal. I just put it in there, and I might slosh it around a little bit and get as much of that stuff off as I can. And then kind of, I generally don't even wring it out. I'll take this string after I've rinsed it in that cold water and just literally lay it out over a saddle stand or on a peg or something like that. And I generally don't want it touching itself. I want to have it hanging.
I think if you let it touch itself, it won't dry.
It won't dry, and that's, you know, because I'm usually dyeing string right before I want to use it, so I want it to dry like this so everything's evening out and I don't have any wet spots in the hide. Everybody has personal preference, and I've done it both ways. This is basically a almost final string that hasn't been beveled. So once this is back dried, you would need to come in and put your bevels on the top side, and that's going to let some of the natural color show through, because even though, you know, we had it in the dye, it didn't go all the way through the rawhide. It's going to only go in just a small layer on the top. So if we were to take a knife and scrape that top layer off it, we would have natural hide again. And that's what our bevel will do. It'll give you a little bit more contrast, a little bit more of a fine line in your color. And I've done it both ways. I typically dye the whole string after it's been beveled. Just personal preference there. You know, some people really like that finer color line. But yeah, but like I say,
Ortega used to dye his calf hides, dye the whole surface, let it dry, and then redamp it,
Yep.
and cut his string, and he had a lot of contrast on the edges on it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people, they'll take a dye and put it right on their circles.
Yeah,
and,
that's what
and
he
rub
did,
it in.
just dye the surface.
And
Yeah.
it's same concept, and it just gives you a little bit more of a contrast.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I use a lot of limed hides, but if you have a scraped hide, you have that same contrast
Yeah,
because you don't
exactly.
take that whole epidermis off, so you still
Exactly.
have that pigment color
Yeah.
from the rawhide.